Greetings, everyone. We're going to look at how to run a canonical correlation in SPSS. Now, remember that in canonical correlation, I describe it as a Pearson R on steroids. In Pearson R, we're comparing one variable and looking at the relationship of one variable to another variable. But in canonical correlation, we're looking at two sets of variables. So it's multivariate nature. Two or more variables on one side and two or more variables on the other side. And so let's take a look at how we do this in SPSS. I'm going to share my screen with you. And here I have a data set, and we're going to look at two different scales, two subscales on the target symptom rating scale. It has an emotional symptom scale and a behavioral symptom scale. The higher numbers represent more symptoms and behavioral problems or emotional problems. And then we're going to look at coping and follow-up. Coping being the higher the score, the more coping we have, and follow-up, the higher the score, the more committed to follow-up we are. These are two subscales on the crisis stabilization scale. These are two scales on the target symptom rating scale. And so in order to run a canonical correlation, I go to Analyze. I go to Correlate, and then I click on Canonical Correlation. And I'm just going to put in my two sets here. I'm going to put coping and follow-up in my first set, and the emotional and behavioral symptoms in the second set. And then I just hit OK, and I wait. Usually it shows me that it's running. There we are. Took a moment for it to run. Kind of does a wacky thing here. And here's my output. And so the first thing we want to look at is that I have two variables in each set. The largest number of canonical variates I can have is 2. And so it runs 2 canonical variates, but only one is significant. The first canonical variate, f of 4,232 equals 3.55, p equals 0.008 is significant. We can look at the eigenvalue, and we can see about 12.3% of the canonical variate is accounted for by the first canonical correlation. But the second one is not significant. So we're only going to look at the first one. And while, I like to pay attention to the standardized canonical correlation coefficients, but first I want to look at the loadings. And the canonical loadings are here. And we can see that both coping and follow-up load strongly. Tabachnik and Fidel recommend 0.3 as a cutoff. And so both coping and follow-up load strongly, and both emotional and behavioral load strongly. Notice that emotional is negative and behavioral is positive. So, and that both of these are negative. And so as coping decreases and follow-up decreases, behavioral problems increase. That kind of makes sense. If I'm not coping well, I'm going to have more behavioral problems. Notice that if coping is not going well and follow-up is not going well, emotional problems are also not going well. Emotional problems seem to be going in the opposite direction. Remember, emotional symptoms would go higher if you have more of them. And so we have a decrease in emotional symptoms when we have a decrease in coping and follow-up. Why is that happening? Well, if I'm not coping, I'm not dealing with stuff. And so that might be what's happening here. And that in order to, that when I am having a really hard time coping, I'm implementing a lot of coping skills, I also have a lot more emotional symptoms. And we can see here from the standardized canonical correlation coefficients, the degree of change. Coping is changing by almost a full standard deviation unit. These are interpreted like standardized beta weights. Emotional symptoms are decreasing by almost a half a standard deviation unit, and behavioral symptoms are increasing by 8/10 of a standard deviation unit. Follow-up isn't changing at all. Follow-up in this case is probably more of a function of coping. So even though it loads, it's not changing a lot. And so coping definitely seems to impact behavioral symptoms in terms of showing improvement. So we might call this like externalizing that when I have when adolescents in crisis are coping better, they might show better behavioral symptoms, but they might also be more emotional because they have a lot more going on. And so if I was going to write an interpretation of this, you could go to my website at balkanresearchmethods.com and pull up my notepad. And in the back of my notepad, I have results for a canonical correlation for actually this analysis. And so you can see how I report that here. I mentioned the cutoff of 0.3 being used. I talk about the statistical significance of the model and the first canonical variant being significant and the values associated with that. And then include a table. And so you can see a format for how this is written. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, and hope this tutorial is helpful.